Alright, so tell me a little bit about yourself. This isn't in the shot, is it? Tell me about yourself.
Graduate programs at commercial banks are a lot broader.
Yep.
So you work all across the bank. There's all these things that aren't really about banking that you can do. So people work in marketing, they work in strategy, things like that. So it's a bit more rounded sort of program than you're gonna get in other places. So it's kind of appealing. You get to work with a lot of people sort of similar age who've just finished university. You build great networks with those people. I'm still really good mates with a lot of the guys that I went through the graduate program with. I think having a university degree and doing well at university it's useful for the first screen of a graduate program or any employment program. If they're interviewing 10,000 people, it gets you from 10,000 to 1,000. The really challenging bit is to go from 1,000 into however many people they hire, which is more the skills you don't learn at university. So they're soft skills, how to interview well. From the 1,000 to 0, I think extracurricular activity is really important. So, jobs you had during university, working in professional fields in similar areas, charity work. For me, I focused a lot on sport and sort of what I learnt through achieving at different levels in sport. The graduate process is pretty rigorous, especially someone coming out of university that doesn't necessarily have a lot of experience in interviewing. Really broadly, we spoke before about the screening. So in the initial phases, they just cull a large percentage of applicants based on marks, quantitative stuff. Yeah, it's a computer program does it. So if you get through that first stage, then you move on to online testing, and that has different forms, but generally you log into a website and they ask you a bunch of questions on in some different areas. So maths, algebra and calculus questions. The challenge is that it's timed, so there's a lot of pressure on you to sort of go through a lot of content quickly. They ask you psychometric questions, which is about behaviours. They look for consistency in your answers. Yeah, I don't think I did any literacy questions. I think maybe
So I crushed the literacy one.
So after you go through that sort of online testing, which is very standardised, sometimes they do online interviews where you again log onto a website, a question pops up, and you speak into a camera and you answer the question in 30 seconds or whatever. And they normally then bring you in for a group interview where they put you in a room with a bunch of other candidates and see how you work in teams and ask you sort of group questions and you have to answer it together. And they normally conclude with a more one-on-one interview. So it'll be you on one side of the table and then 1, 2, 3 or 4 people from the bank on the other, including probably someone from HR, which is when they ask sort of more in-depth questions. In commercial banking, the questions are almost entirely behavioural.
Yeah.
The hardest part of the interview process for me was answering the behavioural questions because I didn't have a lot of professional experience on which to base my answers. All my experience was at university or university jobs like bars and bottle shops.
So how do you think you prepare for behavioural questions?
Well, in hindsight, there is a lot of material available.
Yeah.
So you can look at the types of questions they ask. I think the challenge though is, even if you know the questions they're asking, you don't necessarily know how they want you to answer them. So talking to someone who's done it before is probably the best way to do it. I had the benefit of interviewing people last year and asking the behavioural questions, and it was really interesting to see the way the HR team put together our evaluation sheet on how we should evaluate the candidates' answers, and it was really prescribed. They had to answer the question in exactly the right way. For example, they had to specifically describe the situation, describe their role in the situation, describe how they influenced the outcome, and then they had to finally talk about what policies they put in place to make sure if a similar situation happened again, they'd be in a better position to deal with it.
Yeah.
So even if they answered the question really well, if they did it in reverse order, they talked about the policies they put in place, then they talked about the situation, then we'd have to give them a 1 out of 10, even if they were an awesome candidate with good marks and things. I don't think the the content I learned in the Masters necessarily helped me get the role. I think once you're in the role, it does help. And as far as progressing through your career, postgraduate or further education is so important, and so many people are doing it. If you don't have it, it probably holds you back a little bit. You probably won't get considered for some roles if there are 5 other candidates and they all have, some sort of further education after a graduate degree. You might not be considered. Working in a commercial bank, the business they do ranges from savings accounts for kids or really small amounts, right up until to working with sort of the biggest companies in whatever region they're working in. So in Australia, the ASX 50 or whatever. So there's a really broad range of the business they do. At the top end, they refer to that as the institutional business. If you're working in the institutional business of a commercial bank, the skills that you're learning and the role you're doing on a day-to-day basis is directly translated into an investment bank. They just don't do the smaller transactions at an investment bank. So I think, if you're looking to transition from commercial to investment bank, that's how to do it. Work in one of those teams that you can translate across and get good at what you're doing. The reason I wanted to do it is probably because they are more focused in that area. So the products they can offer to large businesses or working on large transactions is broader and the experience is deeper. So they're just a lot more involved and focused in that area. So if that's where I was working anyway at a commercial bank, I wanted to get better at that, and I wanted to work with people that had more experience, work on more interesting deals, I guess. So that's why I moved across. So I'm a credit analyst. The portfolio I work with is all financial institutions. So it's really interesting. We get to look at basically all the transactions the bank does except for advisory, I guess. So, that's a variety of transactions. So if we're issuing bonds, thank you, issuing bonds for a client, issuing equity for a client, lending money to them, trading derivatives with them, trading anything with them, there's always going to be a little bit of risk to the bank. So we're involved in the process to make sure that we're dealing with the right companies. So it's my job to understand in depth the companies that I've been asked to sort of manage, and understand the transactions we're doing with them in depth. So, and maybe ways in which we might be able to reduce the risk to the bank on a particular transaction. A really interesting day is when one of the clients that is in my portfolio that I manage is doing something exciting from a corporate finance perspective. So they might be looking at buying another company, they might be looking at refinancing prior acquisitions or prior corporate actions that they've made, and they need us to come in and help them either structure it or finance what they're doing. So from my perspective, it's interesting for me to look at the new transaction, what our involvement is, understand the risks to the bank and to our deposit holders and shareholders. It's also interesting to work with the other guys in the bank that might be on the transaction. So if it is a bond issuance, for example, we work directly with the team that helps them issue the bond. We sort of all work together to achieve the outcome for the client. I quite enjoy just, even if it's not on a deal, just learning about a new company as well.
Research.
Yeah, I love doing that.
Yeah, we all do. Don't we all?
We do. So commercial banks, they're looking for a broad range of people with a broad range of skills. Yeah. So, if you love strategy and you did an arts degree, there will definitely be a space for you at a commercial bank. If you love marketing, there's a spot. Entrepreneurship, there's a spot. Investment banks are probably looking for, because they don't do as wide a variety of things, they're very focused on the institutional space. They're probably looking for people who are really focused on corporate finance and sort of more banking related skills, so who want to work on banking transactions. For an investment bank, I'd look for someone who was analytical.
Yeah.
So I knew that if I gave them a lot of information and asked them to go through it and condense it down into a brief summary, they could do that. But I'd also look for someone who I like working with, which is, I think, like any job, I'd pick the guy or the girl that I'd have fun, doing all that analysis with and potentially working long hours, or even if not working long hours, and working every day with. Yeah, so the biggest weakness question, you're going to get that in almost every interview. So my biggest weakness is probably detail. Because I look at things, I look at the big picture, my attention isn't automatically focused towards the detail, which means I have a high tendency to miss the detail. And when the detail is important, that's a problem. So I just got to be conscious of that. It means that, when I'm doing a piece of work, I have to read it 4 times, and then I print it off and I read it again, and then before I send the email, I read it again. That's because I know that that's not my strength. I think the biggest challenge for graduates coming to the workforce is relating to the people in an interview, relating to the interviewers, because it's just really I found it really intimidating talking to people with a lot of experience who'd obviously interviewed a lot of people before, and I hadn't necessarily been in many interviews before. The guys who were really successful were the ones who were comfortable in that situation and could talk to these people the way they would talk to peers, I guess, at university or at work. Whereas, the guys who are less successful in that situation are the ones that are a bit more intimidated, so that they're not as comfortable and they can't really show their personality in an interview.